We'll give people, but we can't see how many people are online, right?
Go again. Oh, if anyone's online, can you just post the question on Skype Q&A? We can't see who's online and who's not. Nothing coming through.
Should we just give them 1 minute and then launch it then?
I guess we'll...
David is here. Hey David, how are you?
Welcome.
Good, we've got
Welcome. Sorry David, we're just waiting on others to join before we commence. That's through now. Welcome Daniel. Howdy Rob.
Alright, so I think people are starting.
Silver, yeah, people are starting to log in now, so got about 5. Let's give it a crack.
Okay. Thanks everybody for logging in. Welcome to the Local Government Power Purchasing Agreement webinar. Special thanks to the folk here at Sustainability Victoria for organising the session for councils to dial in. My name's Scott McHenry from EAGA, if I haven't met you before. On my right, I've got Hugh Butcher here from Darebin City Council, who are leading the first phase of the PPA project. And we've got Brett McDonald from City of Port Phillip, who's going to share some of his insights on the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, which sort of sets a precedence for this particular initiative. We're each going to have a few slides each and then sort of throw it open for you guys to have a bit of a Q&A. So if you've got some questions and they're coming up throughout the presentation, please just pop them into your chat line there and we'll try and consolidate those questions at the start and then see how far we go. So I'm going to just jump right in. So I hope everyone can see the presentation in front of them. So just a little bit of context, the genesis for this project is really comes from councils through the establishment of a local government electricity contracting working group, which was started at the start of this year. It was based on the back of a sector-wide snapshot survey that went around to councils at the end of last year, started this year. And that survey was really about trying to quantify what was going on in the sector and try and flesh out what council's preferences were for establishing off-site arrangements for the purchases of renewable energy. So this first slide here just gives you a bit of an idea of what came back to us from the survey. The full survey results are online on the EAGA and other alliances websites, but across the sector of the whole, we've got around 515 gigawatt hours of demand, and that's split across the 3 contracts that local governments have. So around 41% for the large market, 38% public lighting and 18% for the small market contract. We only saw that around 10% of councils were buying green power, which only equated to around 3.6% of that total 515 gigawatt hours. So if the whole sector was to transition to 100% renewables, we'd have to go and construct around 390 megawatts of capacity. which is quite significant, and we've already seen councils moving into that space. So most notably, the participating councils within the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, who came together with a group of corporates to aggregate their load and go out to market and with what was quite a new project at that time, and that project underpinned the development of the Crowlands wind farm, which is currently under construction. So looking to that success, the working group came together and really started to flesh out how they could use a similar approach to the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, and sort of replicate that in a way that was going to maximise enough participation for the broadest group of councils. This slide really points to the practices of purchasing off-site electricity across councils as we have it at the moment. So the pie chart on the left shows us that nearly all of councils' demands for electricity are met through short-term fixed-term retail contracts, and the survey data told us that only 2.4% of total demand was being met by rooftop solar. So what we're suggesting is that's a fairly high risk approach for councils to adopt, and they should be transitioning to more of a portfolio approach to managing their electricity procurement. So what that portfolio approach might look like is described on the pie chart on the right. So certainly there's a lot of evidence to say that councils can address most of their demand through covering every rooftop they have with solar and doing energy efficiency and addressing about 30 to 35% of their demand by doing that. Certainly a lot of the larger local government projects going on around the state at the moment are demonstrating really attractive paybacks for these types of initiatives. Solar paybacks around 5 to 5.5 years. So these are investments that will repay you handsomely and also add other benefits to those facilities. After you've gone as far as you can with those types of approaches, the opportunities to decrease cost and also reduce emissions now start to lay on the other side of the meter, so off-site. So the portfolio approach might include the next 20% being associated with a local government power purchasing agreement. 20% after that might be associated with a Procurement Australia power purchasing agreement, and the other slices of the pie being allocated to different approaches. Might be a co-investment in a solar farm, or it might be your business as usual. And this approach has the benefits of spreading that risk over different procurement methodologies and potentially different time frames to ride out the peaks and troughs of the energy market. So this is what the working group really came up with. It's a deal on a page. It is a 10-year power purchasing agreement starting at the end of your current retail arrangement. So irrespective of whether you're with Procurement Australia or whether you're with MAV or with the state government, the idea is that you'd roll off at that time and put your designated load into the new power purchasing agreement. The deal will also result in emission reductions, so it includes the provision of large generation certificates or renewable energy certificates. It will be procured via a retailer, so it'll look and feel very similar to your current retail arrangement, and it won't be a contract for difference, which is how the Victorian local government have done their recent renewable auction scheme. So it'll also only be for councils as well, and that was one of the learnings coming out of Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, and that there was a lot of challenges in aligning the various drivers for both local governments and the corporate entities. So this project is designed to remove some of those barriers and just be for councils to participate in only. The project will be located within Victoria, And what we're saying at the moment is we're technology agnostic. So it doesn't matter if it's wind or it doesn't matter if solar, but the procurement process that councils might ultimately go through will sort out what the best deal is for councils. We're anticipating prices of around $65 to $95 per megawatt hour, and that's bundled electricity with the certificates. Councils are currently getting around 110 for peak, and that's just standard black power. That data and information has come back to us through engagement that we've already conducted with retailers around in the middle of this year, where we went out to those providers and asked them some sort of quite generic questions around what wouldn't and would work for a deal like this. And we did get some fairly detailed pricing information back through that process, which sort of underpins these figures here. But again, there's a broad range, and that activity also demonstrated to us that we need to do a lot more thinking around exactly what we're asking for, and so that we really can be starting to compare apples with apples when we end up with a procurement process down the track.
And that should be noted as well, is that particular price that Scott mentioned was feedback from the retailers from an existing project, so it doesn't necessarily include a new project price, but that's something that definitely going to investigate at the next stage. So it should be noted that these are preliminary figures.
Yep, absolutely preliminary, and we've got more investigative work and engagement with retailers to do as the next phase of this project. So thanks, Hugh. So this is a bit of a timeline for the project. So as I said, the working group's been meeting and trying to flesh out a scope of a project that we think is going to work for most councils. And that's sort of happened at the start of the year. We've been doing the engagement with retailers around the middle of the year. We've been taking that information and doing further engagement with councils and trying to refine the scope of the project. And now we've got together a project scope that we think is at a point where we can start recruiting councils and get high level commitment from councils to participating in the next phase. And that's important from an industry engagement perspective, where we're told there are a lot of tire kickers out there at the moment looking for prices. And so I think some of the retailers and energy providers are suffering from a bit of fatigue in that respect. So we're trying to short circuit some of that and get that commitment, that high level commitment from councils from the outset, at least into this first phase of conducting a business case, as you can see is described in the documentation that's been circulated to councils thus far. So we want to get those letters of intent signed by councils by the 17th of October and aggregate that load and then use that to inform quite a detailed business case that would then be used to make some specific recommendations for councils transitioning to a tender, which would be sort of in the first quarter of next year. So that process will incur some costs. You'll see the arrow there on the bottom of the screen. We're going to seek the services of a suitably qualified expert and energy services company to sort of partner with us and provide us some strategic and independent advice along the way. And so we've got some information around the project budget and what items are in some of those fees and some of the costings that we've included in the documentation circulated so far. Just a quick one on governance. So very happy to have Darebin City Council put their hand up as project lead, and this is great for the project because we've got someone like Hugh on board who's obviously got some really good experience to draw upon. He was involved with the MREP project when he was at the City of Yarra, so we're going to leverage some of that expertise as part of the project. We're hoping to set up a project control group. So you probably would have seen in the letter of intent documentation, we're asking councils to nominate a suitable representative to participate in that. And we're asking for sort of director level representation, and that's to facilitate efficient efficient decision making and good information exchange within the partners. And that project control group will be really charged with helping make some of the trickier decisions, but also reporting back to the working group, which is already in operation and it's got its own terms of reference drawn up already. Just in terms of risks, there's been some work put in with developing a risk management plan for the project. Those risks are grouped into 3 major categories. There are risks in the procurement phase, because we've got quite a lot of buyers within the buyers group, most likely that those negotiations with the service provider could potentially become quite protracted and there may be changes to scope. So that's certainly something that's come up with previous buyers groups. So that's why we're trying to address that upfront by the commitment of the CEO and also getting that high level representation on the control group. There'll be market risks associated with the project as well. So we may well see a fall in wholesale prices sort of halfway through the project or in a couple of years as a lot more renewables are coming in to the system. So that's something that we could potentially manage through the advice that we're given by an expert or some smarts in the contracting end of the project. And there will also be risks in the delivery of the project itself. So it's likely and very likely that we'll have some sort of change to the renewable energy target. They say that the only certainty in this space is uncertainty. There are still deals being done by large corporates in the market right now, despite that uncertainty, and it's just a matter of addressing some of those things upfront and managing the expectations of the stakeholders in the contract documentation, and also being conservative too with what we're looking at in the business case phase in terms of modelling the benefits, etc. I should point out that risk management plan will change over the course of the project, but there is one copy available through a hyperlink in the letter of intent documentation that's gone out thus far.
Great, thanks, Scott. So I'm going to talk about now some of the budget estimates that the project has come up with in relation to some of the project needs that we have at this particular stage. So the next slide provides an overview of what we think it's going to cost at this stage for the business case development. So as you can see, we're estimating around about $100,000 that it will cost for 3 types of advice that we need at the moment. The first one is an energy market consultant, which Scott alluded to before. And this will really help develop both the capacity within the group itself around what are the ins and outs of a PPA project that we're developing, understanding how the model works and some of the key considerations that happen both on the sides of the customer, but also on the side of the developer and things like the financiers, etc., and to really understand those sort of pullers and levers, I suppose, and then actually engage with the retail market to understand, you know, whether our model works and validate that, actually get an indication of what, you know, going a little bit further from the initial conversations that have already been had with the retailers around estimated pricing and things like that, having a look at our load, and then doing some modelling on both what our combined aggregate group load looks like, what that forecast modelling over the 10-year period of the contract would potentially look like with some sensitivities in there, but then also looking at some recommendations to come out of that based on that feedback from the market and saying, if you were to go to tender, this is what it would look like and some key considerations that you need to go down the next steps and actually have a bit of a breakdown of some of those cost comparisons. I think at this particular stage as well, it'd be really important to get some legal advice, some very high level legal advice at this stage to understand some of the contractual implications down the path that we're already going down. As Brett will expand on, some of this retail arrangement has already been done before in projects like the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, but just to get an appreciation at this particular stage, some, I guess, high-level implications of what we're doing and some things that we need to think about. And then also bringing a probity advisor on board as well to help throughout the project to ensure that we are making sure that things like the Local Government Act through these processes are being met, and making sure that we're doing we're doing activities and undertakings that aren't going to hamper us in the future. So this gives you a bit of an estimate of what we think the project costs are at this particular stage. These are estimates, and obviously we still need to go to market to actually get some confirmation of these pricing. But the group of us have actually been engaging with the likes of the City of Melbourne to understand how much they spent on these various aspects, both now and then through the various stages of the project. So this hasn't come just with the finger in the air. This has actually come back from a little bit of experience from people who have done it before. So what does the council contributions look like? So as Scott mentioned before, we're asking people to sign on to a letter of intent, but also to sign up a financial contribution to the project. And in part, that's obviously to help pay for the various advisors and consultants that we need along the way, but also, I guess to demonstrate that commitment through a financial element as well. So we've taken the local government performance reporting framework that local government Victoria use in terms of categorising councils, and we've provided a council contribution rate accordingly. So all metro councils and interface councils have a $10,000 rate. Regional cities for the likes of Shepparton and Bendigo, etc., would fall under a more regional city, which is $5,000, and then the small and large shires are cascading down there. So hopefully we feel as though that strikes a balance between, I guess, sharing the resources adequately, but also enabling all types of councils to actually play in this space, considering that we do have some high project costs, I suppose, and allocating that accordingly. And so to give you a bit of an idea, as an example, if we had the breakdown that you see on the next part of the slide around what type of councils would contribute and how much I guess from a quantity point of view that would subtotal up, as you can see, we feel as though that having about this many councils, around somewhere between 10 to 15, would actually meet that need. So I feel as though that we've kind of got the numbers right, both in terms of how many councils are likely to fall out of these council categories, but also how much money would actually come back and how that's been allocated to the project. So the business stage is obviously the first stage in the project, and there'll be further stages being through the tender development, but also tender evaluation and negotiation. The idea, though, is that we believe that this project will go through to tender stage. We've got faith and a good level of understanding that this will have legs, and we don't just want this to be a business case that falls over and we don't go through the next stage. The idea is that we're prepping ourselves for those future stages. So the next slide sort of just gives a summary of those estimates, and obviously these are very much subject to change and based on what the project case, business case looks like in the end, how many participants, etc. But this gives you a bit of a ballpark figure, I suppose, in terms of what to expect in the future. Scott, do you just want to talk a little bit about the next one is around project considerations?
Yeah, just quickly, this is just based on some information on Procurement Australia's last public tender. And highlights the fact that councils are already paying some of these costs in their electricity procurement approach. So typically a third-party procurement agency will take around 1.8% of the total value. So this is just a quick illustrative point saying that councils are already paying quite a lot of money for these types of procurement processes, but the way that we're structuring this is a little bit different at this stage, and we're front-ending some of these costs, but the procurement process will cost one way or the other.
And it should be noted as well is that not only are we front-ending the costs, we're actually taking it a slightly different part. So obviously it's a retail arrangement, but it's actually got some different mechanisms involved in it that we need to nut out. So while we're already paying for some of these costs, probably the new contract structures and the new contract considerations that we're developing aren't something that is I guess, business as usual, and something that's very different in comparison to today.
Yeah, and just one final point on that one. Something for the procurement officers to consider: in a 10-year deal, there are less processes to go through than there are every 2 years. So in some respects, a deal like this will decrease some of those administrative costs on councils.
Alrighty. So this, I suppose, is just reflections on the City of Port Phillip's MREP journey so far. So, you know, congratulations to the City of Melbourne for, you know, their political leadership in allocating the necessary financial resources and staff resources to create and realise the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project. Really a fantastic achievement and demonstrating their, I suppose, continued leadership in this space. And I suppose for the City of Port Phillip, our key drivers for participating in the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project was City of Melbourne asked us. And that was really the toe in. They came and knocked on our door and we thought this is a great opportunity. We didn't understand the process. We didn't really understand what power purchase agreements meant for council, noting that the City of Melbourne knocked on our door probably mid-2015. So MREP has had a lead time of 3+ years and we're about to transition into the MREP contract from 1st of January. So one of those transaction, one of the things associated with that time is the internal transaction cost within the City of Port Phillip. And I suppose part of the process that we embarked upon is all about change management. And so what I've presented on the slide is reasonably generic when looking at change management within council. And one of those things was, you know, the importance of engaging early and often, both horizontally across the organisation, but also vertically as well, and finding out and identifying those key influences that could enable, I suppose, MREP to pass through the internal checks and balances within council. And part of that was really identifying and nailing who are those influences and getting those guys on, and informal guys and girls, on an informal team. And from there, we just built a narrative around the importance of why council should be participating in the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project. There's potentials for, potential for greenhouse gas reduction, potential for energy savings, potential for financial savings, and from there really launching into what are those points within council that are a little bit problematic when it comes to electricity procurement. In some ways, electricity procurement in council is not a favourite subject. It's something that is really part of the status quo, and it's heavily, there is an inertia there that is really difficult to change. And one of those things that we really need to do is to identify what those changes are required and how we make those things happen. And important to us was, you know, engaging the right people, encouraging their participation, building up a sense of ownership and a sense of responsibility over the eventual actions. So granted, you know, we're now in the 3rd year of this wonderful journey. We are now starting to transition into that allocation of, not necessarily allocation, but individuals within council taking some responsibility over the implementation. When it comes to that change process, and as I was writing the slides last night, it's really easy to say, you know, make it easy to embrace change. And what I mean by that is really working with those key influences to help them understand how they can embrace change. Noting there's going to be lots, arguably, some resistance to shift away from the business as usual. And part of that is, as sustainability officers or procurement officers, being prepared for that change. So mapping out the process. And so as Scott mentioned, we have, you know, short-term business as usual contracting of generally 3 years. The City of Port Phillip has historically used the MAV. There's some benefits associated with that, that status quo or that current process. And part of being prepared is interrogating that to find out what works and what doesn't. And one of those things that didn't work for me was a diversity of different retailers. And it was very difficult for us to get on top of, you know, which retailers were supplying at whatever time over whatever period. And so at some point we ended up having about 5 retailers. And so one of my objectives was to, you know, use the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project to get some convergence on that, to reduce that number down to, you know, 1 or 2, so we can have a better control over who is actually supplying our power. The other part of that point is, what are those things that we're not actually receiving? What are those elements of our current contracting that we're not receiving good value for? And so if you're exposed to the MAB procurement process. You would have had exposure to ERM. ERM Power provide a wonderful silver service when it comes to engaging their customers. They are head and shoulders above the rest, and we wanted to use those great elements of of ERM, and include them into the MREP contracts. So we've established I suppose, a baseline of expectation of what we're requiring in terms of an energy retailer, and just transferring that across. And so, as sustainability officers, there's no loss to us that we can identify our needs and say we want X, Y, and Z, and seek to incorporate those into the existing MREP contracts. As part of being prepared is considering options as well. And as we're going through this process, we considered around 11 different options of how do we get the City of Port Phillip to zero net emissions by 2020. Do we follow a BAU type of process? Do we follow MREP? And there were maybe 5 or 6 options within MREP. Do we look at Procurement Australia? Do we look at this project? So in fact, this project was our plan B if MREP didn't happen. Do we look at decoupled LGCs? Or do we have, or do we explore direct investment in a wind farm or a solar farm? And part of that process of identifying and looking at the pros and cons of each of those options was then working through a process and seeing which ones are realistic and which ones are not, and working through a process to say, well, actually, we love those ideas around direct investment, but that's not right for us now. It may be at some point in the future, but not right now. And MREP, was something on the table for us to explore. Our transaction costs or staff involvement costs were relatively low compared to other processes. And that, I think that transaction cost, when you look at the broader scheme of things, will certainly pay dividends. So for us, it was a lot of my time, a fair bit of internal stakeholder time as well, but not so great. But the result, being that we'll have 100% green power for the next 10 years from the 1st of January. And that's for our large market sites, our small market sites, and our unmetered street lights. And that will reduce our gross greenhouse gas emissions by 87%. And that alleviates a lot of pressure for us. But part of that is building a narrative around the difference and making sure that initiatives around energy efficiency and solar PV remain. And that's one of my lessons, or one of my reflections, was just being clear in language. One of the challenges of MREP is there's a whole lot of complexity in this space: electricity contracting, electricity futures, the contracts, of which there are 4. So we have a participation agreement, a retail service agreement, an LGC supply agreement, and a tripartite agreement. And there's inherent complexity in all of those. And it is about how you communicate that complexity in a simple way. And I suppose one of my reflections, I probably didn't convey that in the most simple way possible. In some ways, it was a reflection of the process that as we're going through this process, we're looking at the options and trying to be as open and clear and transparent in the options that were available to council, and using that as an opportunity to welcome and invite questions. And to their credit, both my line management and councillors presented us with a whole suite of questions. And those questions, in terms of their complexity and I suppose completeness and rigour, I suppose varied from individuals that had very little information and no knowledge about electricity markets to someone that has a professional career in electricity contracting. So we're trying to accommodate a broad spectrum of experiences, and part of the process is really being open to those and responding to any questions, any and all questions as they come in, and answering them as best you can. There is always uncertainty and risk, but it is about providing an appropriate answer for all of those questions that arise. And as you progress through this process, hopefully some of these risks start to reduce. And so certainly after the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, we've kicked a lot of goals and reduced a lot of risk, but there are still some risks that will certainly come to bear. Part of the process is also being just being mindful of what are your contingencies. Scott, mentioned the portfolio approach. What is your plan A? Think about your plan B and think about your plan C. What do you want to achieve as part of this process as well? And are there any kind of key risks that are going to be an internal barrier for you, be it for your internal stakeholders within the administration or at council level? So once you've identified those key risks, you can then put in place appropriate processes or information to mitigate those risks. That mitigation might come through information provision alone, or it could come through third-party expert advice, or it could be dealt with through whatever the eventual contracts. And the other one is just a very basic notion of where is the discomfort and the concern for people, and it's a question around almost a question around where they sit in the organisation at the moment and how they're interacting with their electricity procurement. And in some ways it's a reflection, well, it is a reflection of the individual, and this project can be framed in a way that reduces a lot of transaction costs for council, but we don't need to now go out to market for our electricity contracting until early 2028, and so there's probably 3 or 4 tender processes that we miss out on or avoid, but that I suppose that investment of time gets transferred to some yearly sort of administrative processes that are required as part of the MREP contracts. So we have to embrace that change and engage people across the organisation or your organisations to make it happen. And it's you can, I suppose, make it incumbent upon yourself to be the lead. And so I made it incumbent upon myself to be the lead and push MREP within the city of Port Phillip, and making sure appropriate people were on that journey. So those people were the CFO, the finance team, the governance team, assets and procurement, as well as line management and sustainability. And as part of that change process, it was really, in some ways, wonderful to have senior leaders of the organisation being prepared to sit in the council chamber and support the project. And it's those sorts of key individuals that really help to get MREP across the line. So ultimately, how do we make this happen? Formulate a team, whether it's formal or informal, and get them to participate in the project governance as much as possible. The tender process, the tender evaluation process. So I sat on the tender evaluation panel. It'd be good to include council stakeholders in contract negotiations as well. And that's part of building not only skill and capacity, but building momentum for the project as well. So you won't end up with, coming back to that idea of, engaging early, often building a sense of responsibility and accountability for the outcomes. And as Hugh mentioned, that this project will be engaging third-party experts, and the third-party experts as part of MREP are critical for us to get MREP across the line at the City of Port Phillip. And we had energy market experts that provided advice on the energy market, provided advice on counterparty risk or the generator risks, supply risk from Crowland Wind Farm into the NEM, legal we had legal consultants as well who drafted the documentation. We also engaged our preferred legal team to review those documents just to see if there was any, opposing or points of conflict, but that information, the advice we received from our in-house, so not our in-house legal team, but our preferred legal company lawyers was consistent with the MREP lawyers. Importantly, MREP lawyers also provided a document called a letter of reliance for all of the MREP parties, of which there are 14, and effectively it's just sort of a wraparound note to say that everybody as part of MREP can trust the advice that that they'll be providing as part of the project, and that that along with Procurement Australia navigating the procurement process, and Court and Heath being the probity advisors really helped, I suppose, mitigate some of the concerns or prevailing uncertainties around the rigour of the process. And those, I suppose, that expert advice was paramount, ultimately, in getting MREP across the line. Given we've come so far in MREP, I'd also encourage you to reach out to all of the 4 local governments that have participated in MREP to glean from them their experiences. The experiences I had at the City of Port Phillip, I'm sure, are going to be fairly different from that of the City of Melbourne, and equally with the City of Moreland and the City of Yarra as well. Next point was when it comes to internal dialogue and in building the internal business case, keep it simple. It's easy to say, it was difficult for us to execute. As I mentioned before, we had explored 11 high-level options to a reasonable level of detail, and within MREP there were about 6 options. And if I had my time again, I would cut those options down and only present 1, maybe 3 in total for council consideration. But ultimately, you have to take advice and guidance from your internal stakeholders, particularly your procurement, governance, and your finance team, your CFO. Political leadership was also crucial as part of this project, insofar as you can only mitigate so much risk and address so much uncertainty through the contracting process and through information provision. And so at some point there needs to be an acceptance of that uncertainty and acceptance of that risk. So, full credit to the councillors at the City of Port Phillip, for endorsing that we would be buying 100% green power for the next 10 years for all of our electricity. It really is a wonderful outcome. It's 3 years of hard work. In some ways, it's a journey that, upon reflection, was a good one. But I suppose there's always opportunity for improvement. And I think as we seek to replicate aggregate power purchase agreements across the sector, we're able to cut down that timeline and reflect on the processes that we went through for MREP. And so I think for MREP we're 3 years to this point, and we're kind of looking at a 12 to 18 month process for this project. The other point is, as Scott mentioned, just around that policy change and political uncertainty. That is the only that is one constant that is coming to bear, is that policy uncertainty is just a constant that we have to deal with. And now is the right time. Levelised cost of energy for large utility retail, large scale renewables is certainly coming down. There's some uncertainty around the RET, but we have to have skin in the game and we have to have a crack. And it's a wonderful time to be in to be working in this space.
Great.
Okay, thanks, Brett. Look, I've just got one more slide before we jump into some questions from attendees. This last one really just draws the points made together and reflects what's being asked of councils now that's articulated in the letter of support. And hearing Brett's insights from MREP, you would have seen that we've gleaned a lot of learnings from Brett and his counterparts in the other councils that have really coloured both what we're asking of councils commit to and the scope of the project. So It's a minimum of 20% of load per council, so that could be a mix of your contracts or one of your contracts. It doesn't have to be just 20%. You can certainly be more ambitious than 20%, and certainly some of our discussions with councils so far have indicated that some members are, well, some councils are willing to go up to 100. It'll probably depend on how that council or your council wants to present or communicate that project, but we're leaving it open. The letter of intent also commits councils to allocating some internal resources in terms of providing data into the business case, NIMI information, etc. We've mentioned the staff time and being actively engaged with the decision making, as Brett's just mentioned again. So there are provisions in there to nominate on that letter of intent, and also let us know which category you fit into in terms of your financial commitment, and we would like to have those letters back by the 17th of October, and they can be emailed directly to Hugh.
Indeed.
So
questions just come in. So how many councils have committed to this project so far?
So far we've had 3 councils sign up with letters, and we've got about 2 or 3 who have said the letter is on its way. So combined, using those 5 council examples, we're looking at around about 15 or 16 gigawatt hours so far, which has already made the project quite substantial, and we're sort of moving along. We've heard probably about from another half a dozen or so who have informally said, yes, we're going to respond and we're going to participate, and we're just in the process of getting sign off. So we feel as though that we're comfortable already sort of 5, 6 plus, and then quickly moving into upwards of 10. So there is really strong interest, and one of the things that I want to make mention as well is that a lot of the interest has actually come from a wide variety of councils, so not just the metro councils, but also a lot of rural councils as well, which is really good and exciting to have a nice variety.
So the questions are a few parts. So the second part is, and would there be a consideration for metro councils to commit to only the business case development to more clearly understand the type of PPA model that might be adopted and obtain clearer retail prices?
So there's probably a couple of questions in there. I'll try to break them down in 2 parts. So there's the concept of whether the business case development commitment to first stage only. Obviously, it's a bit hard for participants to commit to a future stage that we don't know what it looks like. Obviously, we're anticipating, as I said before, that this is viable, and we would just want to run the numbers in 2018 versus running the numbers 2 years ago, which are very different environment and very different sort of key considerations, and also the actual the final arrangement of how the project works might be slightly different to something like MREP. So I suppose that there is no commitment, I guess, to future stages, but the idea is that we want those who commit now, we want to keep them on board with the intent of going to tender in a future stage. But this is not a firm commitment to the future stages. We don't have pricing. We don't know what that looks like. So I guess it's that delicate balance of understanding that's why we want the financial commitment now, so that people can spend the money to understand what the business case is, and to also commit the in-kind resourcing that is required of a project of this nature. I guess that if we take a step back around the types of PPA models that might be adopted more generally, so if councillors are out there that don't feel as though they're ready to commit, but want to go on, I guess, an education and I guess a capacity building exercise, there's lots of information out there already around the different types of PPA models that could be invested in. Certainly, the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project got some funding to develop a document, and that is it's called, what's it called, Brett? You've got a picture of it.
Renewable energy procurement. So this is, you can find this. I think there was a link.
There's a link in the letter of intent and project scoping document. Yeah.
And you'll be able to use your favourite search engine to locate it.
Yeah, and in addition to that as well, there's a University of Melbourne have got a PhD student Paris, who's been doing a lot of work in a similar space and understanding what those sort of purchasing arrangements could potentially look like, specific to local government.
Yep. And so Paris did a wonderful job, and I suppose my commentary back to Paris was that I think she was the only person that had interviewed all of the MREP partners to gain their, I suppose, understanding and insight on MREP. And in many ways, those insights are contained in her report, which are now public, and it's called Local Government Renewables Group Purchasing. And you should be able to find it on the Resilient Melbourne website, and we'll share the links afterwards. And alternatively, I'll be able to provide some background information on PPAs as well. So a lot of lawyers are doing PPA primer documents to send out to their customer base. NAB have also, the National Australia Bank rather, have also a few documents on PPAs as well, and that just helps understand the broad principles of PPAs, and I think importantly for the local government sector, how we navigate where we are now in terms of BAU to what a PPA might actually look like and what change is involved, so we can transition across to a PPA.
Great.
And there was another comment here, just not disregarding the next stages of the project, e.g. tendering, but a stage commitment aligned with the project commitments would potentially make it easier for councils to jump on board in the early stages.
So I think in response to that, I think we've kind of done that in some respects, is that we've said that we want people to commit to the process that we've outlined so far, and in this initial business development stage, and said these are the kind of outcomes that we're trying to achieve through the business case development, being X, Y, and Z, and that's very much, I think, clearly articulated in the letter of intent. As I said before, we think that the outcomes of this will be market viable, so we'll want to go to that next stage. But at this stage, the commitment is only for that first stage, which is the business development. But that's why we're asking for people to put in-kind financial contributions, but also then put a particular load in from their energy markets to commit to this. And I'd say that without even selling our project short, and going back to Scott's previous pie chart of I guess the portfolio approach, is that there is other offers out there, I suppose. Depending on the size of your council and your council load, you could do it alone, so you could go down this path yourself. Alternatively, Procurement Australia are running a very similar process at the moment, and we made mention of this at our teleconference last week that we hosted, and we're saying that this is something to consider. And some councils are putting some of their load into the Procurement Australia project. Some councils are putting some into this particular project. Some councils are going to put all of their into one or the other. So I guess that there is definitely options out there and slightly different approaches, and people need to understand what they're trying to get out of this process and out of this project, and see if that aligns with the actual offer that's out there. And if it doesn't align, that's okay. But I guess if there's something that's slightly different to what you're trying to achieve, then maybe you need to consider whether this is the right time for you to jump into it. Have we got any other questions at this stage? We've only had Sally from Burundara ask that a couple of questions there. Have we got any additional ones? And if so, jump online and into the message board and type away. We'll just play the waiting game.
Just picking up on that last question while we're waiting for further questions, there is another power purchasing agreement project that's been scoped in the southeast. It's been called the Southeast SEMREP, and that will again try and replicate the MREP model. So it'll bring councils together with corporates, large manufacturing businesses in the region, with the intent of getting scale from doing so. So that's great. And I understand some of those councils in that area may also be thinking about that portfolio approach as well. So one council has already signed their letter of intent. Will be participating in both already, and I can see others going down that road. So we very much feel that these approaches are complementary to each other and not necessarily competing with each other.
Is there any contact details of that SEMREP project?
Yeah, so if you are interested in knowing more, I encourage you to get in contact with my counterpart from the South East Council's Climate Change Alliance, Dominic Lafontaine, and I can circulate Dominic's contact details, or just get in touch and I'll connect you.
Great, and we've received a question. So what's expected from directors on the project control group? e.g. number of meetings?
That's a good question. I don't think we've quite got there yet with what the control group is going to look like. Hugh, did you have any thoughts with frequency of meetings and time investment?
Look, in this initial stage, we're looking at sort of a 3 to 4 month window to get to once we've actually started up and get through. So I don't think there's going to be a large amount of, work done at that project control group at the initial stages. I guess one of the things that we want them to do, and getting back to the idea, is to make key decisions on the project. I suspect that what that's going to look like is going to be more towards the end of the project, when we've got a draft report around the business case, understanding some of those key sort of considerations around what the contract structure looks like, or options around contract structure. So I think that might happen in the second half. So that I'm anticipating somewhere between 2 and 3 meetings for this initial business case development. So not necessarily resource intense, but obviously like normal chain of command and hierarchies work within local government, is I guess the grunt work will be done by the bulk of the people doing representatives at the project level, and that information will be fed up, I suppose.
And just on that point, I think that's kind of reflected with the indicative timeline provided in the documentation. So we've flagged some key decision dates, and that was but based on learnings from other group buying PPAs, where the providers said that the biggest cause for delays was the decision-making processes within the members of the buying group, and how the fact that those decision-making processes didn't line up. So again, we've tried to address some of those or incorporate some of those learnings into the approach that we've outlined for you guys so far.
The other point to make as well is that participation on the project control group is optional. It's opt-in. Ideally, those who don't participate, I guess, are looking for the rest of the group to provide that decision-making process for them on their behalf. So it's something that if you're not well resourced for, or not interested in, the decisions will be made on behalf of your organisation by those members that are actively on the project control group.
And I'd add, really is reflective of your internal consultation process. And I, do think it's important you have membership on project control groups or in governance in some way, just to build and maintain momentum.
Is there any other questions from those who are listening now? We've got about 5 minutes to go before this is expected to wrap up.
I will say that I will share my contact details, so if you want to give me a call and talk in some detail around the experiences and what any concerns you might have in participating in a aggregate PPA project, happy to have those conversations offline. Might even consider another webinar or another presentation that goes into the detail as much as we can without sort of treading on confidentiality, because there's a lot there, and so certainly sort of the reasonably high level that I was talking at today, difficult, but I think it's once we get into the substance, that's where things start to really matter, not necessarily on the content and content awareness side, but really highlights the importance of good, thorough and meaningful internal engagement.
Looks like the questions have ended, so we might wrap up 2 minutes early. So just a special thanks again to the team here at SV for organising this webinar for everyone to dial into. We will get a video recording of this presentation, and we'll get that out as a download link or similar in the coming days. And the contact details for the project are also provided in the back of the letter of intent documentation. So you can speak to us, myself, Hugh, or any of the Alliance executive officers if you've got any specific questions as well.
And just further to that point, that we are really, wanting to help every single council to participate. We want as many as possible. Obviously, the bigger number of participants and the bigger the electricity load, the more attractive it is from a market perspective. So we want to get everyone on board that is interested. So don't hesitate to call your local Greenhouse Alliance member or myself directly to talk about sort of the ins and outs offline between now and the 17th of October. It's something that we're very much committed to. Great.
Thanks everyone for participating. See you soon.
Bye for now.